Well, welcome everyone to the Working Across Board Level Committee, Compliance Committee breakout session for the afternoon. I'm extremely honored to have such an exceptional panel with me today. And here we'll be discussing primarily the way in which these leaders next to me here engage with their various compliance committees at their organizations, ways in which to do so effectively, relationship building, risk profiling, and a variety of other matters as well. So without further ado, I'll just quickly do a brief introduction. I've written everyone's titles down. Please, if I left any out, let me know. There are several amongst the group here. Next to me, Melissa Stapleton Barnes, Senior Vice President, Enterprise Risk Management and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Eli Lilly and Company.
Got it.
Got them all? Very good.
The awkwardly long title. Yes.
Well, equally as awkwardly long as Louis Saperman's Vice President, Associate General Counsel, and Chief Compliance Officer at Dun & Bradstreet.
Would you believe there are 3 parts of it that I take off of my card?
Really?
Yeah, it gets longer.
Is black belt one of them?
Well, black belt is not in the title.
Not in the title.
That's just I
Okay.
use that to scare people when I need to.
Me too.
Very good. And next to Louis is Hope Scott, Vice President, Chief Risk and Compliance Officer of Blue Shield of California. So welcome, Hope. Great. So to get things started, really to set some context and provide some background, really could each of you, perhaps we'll just go down the line, provide some color around which committees you all have experience with and sort of the roles you play with respect to these committees. So Melissa, I'll
And these
go
are board committees.
That's
yes?
correct.
Okay,
Board.
so board
Your
committees.
board, yeah.
Yeah, because there are various governance committees,
Lots of
right?
committees.
Across the executive team as well as board. We'll start with board. So at Lilly, we have a public policy and compliance committee that's dedicated to just what it says, public policy, but also overseeing the ethics and compliance program at Lilly. There's obviously some overlap with the audit committee as well. And so the public policy and compliance committee meets 4 times a year. But in one of those meetings, there is a joint session with our audit committee. And that's to ensure, because you can have these risk committees or public policy and compliance committees. And the fear, of course, is that something will fall between the audit committee and these compliance committees. And so the idea for us to mitigate against that was to have at least one meeting per year where the two come together and we talk about those issues and share data across, et cetera. I also I obviously attend and report into the Public Policy and Compliance Committee. I also attend the Audit Committee, and there are questions that go within both of those committees. So that's how we're structured with our board along these lines. Louis?
So we have several committees of the board. The key committee for compliance purposes is our audit committee, and that is the one I have a dotted line reporting relationship to the chair of the audit committee. And we do have a technology committee that oversees things like technology security issues, which certainly do have overlap similarly with some of the work that the audit committee is doing. And I also do generally an annual report to the board of directors as a whole. So I tend to work through those three bodies.
So I report to the audit committee. I have an audit committee that's responsible for overseeing the effectiveness of our compliance program as well as our enterprise risk management program. And they meet about 7 or 8 times a year, and I report to them about 5 times a year. And anytime I'm not there, they have questions that I need to be there to answer. So it just keeps getting more and more time consuming to report to the board and the audit committee. Annually, I also do a report to the board on enterprise risk management, usually when we do our enterprise risk assessment.
And if I could amend my answer.
Well, then
One
I'm
of the
going to amend
disadvantages-
mine too.
One of the disadvantages of going first, I would say as to the enterprise risk management, because that's obviously as part of my title, something we're also responsible for. It used to be actually in that joint committee meeting. We normally did it then, but just recently, in this past year being the first time, we have moved the enterprise risk management discussion to the full board. Actually, it was in focusing on mitigation this time around, and it was, I think, not a huge change logistically in that, given with both the audit committee and the public policy and compliance committee attending that meeting anyway, we were just missing a few. And as it turns out, those few were very interested in enterprise risk management. So that move to the board was, seemed to make sense. I also do an annual report on the state of compliance, the state of the union, if you will. And I do that in that joint committee between audit and public policy and compliance. So.
Very good, very good. So, Hope, I'm going to put you on the spot right off the bat. Given all those various interactions you have with your various committees at the board level, do you have any advice on shaping an effective agenda with these different committees, and how you proceed with doing that?
Yeah, so, I look at myself as sort of the liaison between management and the board. So I have to be, as clear and transparent with the board as I can. At the same time, I want to make sure they don't get some weird impression of management and the activities that are going on, within the business. So I think the most significant piece of advice I would give is make sure that everyone is aligned before you start talking. I have a ton of documents that I have to prepare for my various meetings, and sometimes they're all risk, sometimes they're heavier on compliance, sometimes it's the annual report. So I have a bunch of materials that the board or the audit committee is going to read, and they do read everything I give them in advance. So really what I want to do is make sure that I'm having conversations with my management team, with the CFO who sits in the audit committee meeting as well, with my general counsel, and make sure that they know what I'm going to talk about. I meet quarterly with the CEO of the company, so again, I can kind of tell him what keeps me up at night. And then I have a meeting usually within 2 weeks prior to the committee meetings. I meet with the chair of the audit committee and talk through anything that's on my mind or anything I want her to help facilitate the conversation around. And then sometimes she'll bring things to me at that time and say, hey, at the last meeting or in some other meeting you weren't at, we were talking about X, Y, or Z. Can you be prepared to talk about those things? Sometimes it's as big as I want you to put together a few slides and give a presentation on something. Other times it's very simple, like just focus on these things. It's all very well orchestrated and very well planned. And then I have at least one member of my audit committee. He is the former head of the CIA. And he will say something completely ridiculous and off script and send me off in a completely different, unplanned direction. So, and if he's not there, our board chair will usually step into the void and say something crazy like, 3 years from now, you told us you were going to report on this thing that hasn't been invented yet. Can you talk about that now? And I'm like, sure, not a problem. I'll do that now. So a lot of planning, a lot of conversation, both with management and to the extent you can with your board members or your committee members, so that there are no surprises, and then you can have a really productive conversation, and you can focus their attention on what you either want to convey to them or feedback you need to get from them.
Very good. Melissa or Lewis, anything to, in your experience, effective agenda building? Anything to add?
So I think that a lot of it does come down to how strong your committee chair is and how good your relationship is with your committee chair. I think that I have been very lucky. Our audit committee chair is a very seasoned professional and has been doing this for a long time. And so meeting with him prior to the meetings, we walk through everything. He'll throw on one or two other thoughts if I haven't raised them to say, this is something that I think is on people's minds. Let's make sure we address that too. So that by the time we get to the meeting, it is as much the committee chair driving the agenda as me. And I'm in the room more as expert as opposed to being the person building the agenda in that moment.
Yeah, and we proceed pretty similarly. We have similar calls with our committee chairs, and my experience is as yours. Ours is particularly active, very involved, been doing this a while, and in some respects is my best friend in making that run very smoothly. We formalize the prep conversations in that we have what we call our Compliance and Enterprise Risk Management Committee, and that's that's basically our executive team minus the CEO. And anything that goes to Public Policy and Compliance Committee or the board will go to that committee first. And it does a number of things. One, it in some respects we get the benefit of their brains, and some, and they can speak into those materials. At the same time, it serves the purpose of no surprises. It's framed and cast the right way, and it makes for a much smoother conversation. So it sounds like we're operating pretty similarly.
Yeah, and you both touched on relationship being a key part
Absolutely,
of this engagement.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure, board members are people,
Right.
right? And so to the extent you can interact with them and build relationships in a way that helps your credibility, all the better.
So for those in the room that maybe don't have that existing relationship, any advice on perhaps solidifying between the exec team and the chair or the committee?
Sure. Well, I mean, again, I think transparency and credibility is key. And if there's, so I also happen to sit on a board, and that's helped me tremendously in thinking about what would I want to know if I were in their chair. And that's kind of the litmus test that I always tend to apply is, what do I hope that the management and the company where I sit on the board is bringing to me? And if I were sitting on the Eli Lilly and Company board, would I want to know this? That's my litmus test, and it's and I tend to be pretty transparent. Not to the point that it raises, that there's a lot of false positives, right? I mean, because I think that harms your credibility too. I mean, if it's something that's of the magnitude that needs to go to the board, you need to have some level of certainty around it, and it needs to meet a pretty high threshold. I think I've got that litmus test, but I test that in these meetings, in these pre-calls, right? I'm thinking about this. I think this is something the committee would want to know about, and I can check that with the chair of the committee. So it's I think it's as you would build a relationship with anyone, right? It's trust and credibility, and that's been my experience.
I think that one of the great pieces of advice I received when I first started working with the board was that, much as Melissa said, board members are people, and they are no different than you and me, and they want to be treated like people, not being put on a pedestal and kowtowed to all the time.
Right.
And so speaking to them in a conversational, personal tone, getting to know them on a personal level, much like you would anybody else that you're trying to build a friendly relationship with. I think that should hold no different for most of your board members. And I like the way Melissa put it in sort of helping your board a bit. The way I've often thought about it is aiding your board in knowing what questions to ask. The fact of the matter is they will look at you as the expert. So every time you can think about, well, if I put myself in their shoes and I wanted to do my fiduciary duty as best I could, what question would I ask of Lewis when he's in the room? Because you and your team should know those answers. But the board, they're not there every day. So at every opportunity, just handing it over, that transparency, saying, this is the way you should look at this, and these are the kinds of questions you should be pushing us on. One, it frankly will build a lot of confidence because the board realizes you are willing to deal with the tough issues. But two, I think it really does aid your board in being a lot more effective in evaluating your programs.
And you had mentioned was putting yourself in their shoes and coming with that question set. So with that in mind, how important or what's your perception on having compliance experience on the board when sort of going through that mental exercise? And as boards continually to increase their diversity numbers, if you will, I mean, does this change at all with respect to compliance?
Okay, so I want you to all imagine this is my soapbox, and this is me standing on it. So the regulatory environment is very clear from Sarbanes-Oxley and from the various stock exchanges that public companies may sit on, that financial expertise is required at the board level, whether it be at the audit committee, at the board level, or otherwise. And there's good reason for that. The board is responsible for overseeing the finances of the organization. Well, the board has taken the mantle of also overseeing the ethics and compliance programs of organizations. For boards not to have compliance expertise feels to me like a huge miss. Now, I say this from a standpoint of being infinitely lucky, because I actually have compliance expertise on my audit committee and on our board. And it has been of great value. I love the fact I have Judy Reinsdorf, who was the former general counsel for Tyco and then Johnson Controls. She is on our board. And constantly, she and I, in our audit committees, have great discussions about things we can be doing better. That is so wonderful. Frankly, it's the reason I come to conferences like this, to have discussions with all of you, so that it can push my thinking. But somebody who's on your board who has that fiduciary duty and can bring to the table expertise of their own can really be truly invaluable to your program. And to me, so I think that there should be something codified out there that says this should happen. But certainly from my own experience, it has been just of wonderful value to have that expertise on our board.
Yeah, it's something certainly on Ethisphere's side. Michael Byrne, I'll put you in the spot, is we revise our methodology every year as part of our ethics quotient process, and of course, World's Most Ethical Companies process. We look to find out ways in which we can start measuring that as well. So it's sort of the criteria we're looking at as we continue to revise sort of the methodology.
But it does jump out. When someone has that,
Absolutely.
It's notable. It's not normal.
Right.
Or
Right.
average.
Right.
Which is unfortunate.
Right.
That's right.
But I will be happy to be a spokesman of the fact that it is of great value. Sitting as CCO of a public company, the fact that we have that expertise makes our program more effective. Right. It's that simple.
Right. Yeah. Very good point. I hope I'll give you one additional question as well. When given the competing priorities that are put in front of the board every single day, I mean, how do you continue to make compliance a priority? I mean, what can you do to make sure that compliance and ethics doesn't lose out on the agenda?
So we're not a public company, so we're a not-for-profit company, we're a mission-driven company, and so all of our risk appetite statements and strategic objectives revolve around the company's mission, which means that it revolves around our company's reputation. So both the management and the board are very riveted around our reputation and our reputation for doing the right thing and serving our members, the people who take our insurance coverage. So it's something that's top of mind all the time for all of them, whatever committee they're sitting in. So compensation committee, whatever, all of the various board committees, they're really focused on ethics, integrity, and they look to me as the person who's going to give them sort of the straight story on what is going on in the space. So it's never, I sit in the audit committee. I'm usually the person who's last to give my report. I'm always fascinated by all the financial information and the audit stuff, and then it's like a nice palate cleanser for them to get to the non-financial stuff, and our external auditors shut up for a minute. But they're very interested in what I have to say about sort of the corporate culture of compliance. I report to them in my written materials a summary of every investigation that we do. So every compliance investigation, both compliance and ethics and Medicare compliance, which is also under my purview. And sometimes they focus in on something, what happened here, what next, is there a trend, that kind of thing. So they do get, pretty granular about it, but they're very, they always want to know, do I have the support I need? Is management, giving me what I need to get the job done? Is there anything that we can be doing differently or should be doing differently. Of course, every year I provide board training for, we call it code of conduct training, but it's really a broad discussion about topical issues in compliance and ethics. And this year, one of the main, or last year really, was one of the main focuses was sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. And they continue to push on that, you know, how do we figure it out and whether we have a problem, you know, how many reports of harassment do we have? Thankfully not many, but does that mean anything? You know, so they're always hungry for information about what's going on in the compliance and ethics space. And I think they really understand their role in setting the tone and tenor for the organization. So in my annual report, which, so for 2017, I would have given it in February of 2018, and I say, you know, I'm very specific to say, like, I feel, you know, fully supported by both the board and management in all of the work that we're doing, and they get a very 360 view of the compliance and ethics programs. So it's, for me, it's not too hard. They're not going, oh yeah, we don't have time to hear about it. And there have been times when the meetings have run over and I'm like, yes, I don't have to talk. And they go, we're going to have a call, you know, we're going to schedule a call to reconvene to finish hearing about Hope stuff. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great. More stress in my life. But yeah, they never skip it.
Very good. So this is an initial prompt for the audience. We will open it up for questions here momentarily. But in the meantime, you had mentioned they're hungry for more information. It was a key phrase that I latched onto. For those boards that perhaps are not hungry for information, I know, Louis, you touched on putting yourself in their shoes, but I'm interested to see if you all have any advice on how you filter, how you percolate to the top the information you end up sharing. And I'll give a data point and an anecdote to sort of support that comment. One of which was, if you caught Al Rose's presentation today on his panel, he had mentioned that board meetings that contain data as part of the presentation go 10 times better typically. In addition, some of the data we look at Ethisphere, we actually ask organizations, you know, what are you presenting to the board? And of the, I think, 16 or so different elements that we track over the last 5 years, all have increased substantially in the number of organizations that report out to the board each of these different facets. So with the additional data, all of this information, how do you prioritize, or how do you really filter?
Right. Maybe I'll start.
Please,
And you guys
please.
can jump in. So we've just recently undertaken a project to look at just this topic. Because we routinely, so we meet 4 times a year, as I mentioned, and each of those meetings are accompanied by a pre-read, which contains a document with our metrics, right? These are the reports where we talk about investigations, hotline reports, you know, the standard things that you would find in those kinds of reports. And I meet, of course, with the Public Policy and Compliance Committee for those 4 quarters. In order to sort of balance the sort of day-to-day, the running of a program with sort of deeper dives, we've changed our agenda just recently. And so I mentioned that it's a Public Policy and Compliance Committee. So 2 of the 4 meetings, we are now going to take a deep dive in public policy issues, and there are no shortage of those in the healthcare industry. And so there's plenty to talk about in that space, right? But 2 of those are going to be reserved for ethics and integrity issues, where we can do deeper dives and have much more robust conversations about things like anti-corruption and other issues du jour, if you will, sexual harassment, and what we're going to do with respect to our program in that space as well. So there's that. Now, I always have the opportunity to discuss metrics and what's happening on the day-to-day with the board. So I have a reserved period of time in each of those 4 committees, but in 2 of them, I get a deep dive, and thus far with that's really worked, because we're not rushing through, we're not competing for time with the next public policy topic. It's an opportunity for the board to really get in and learn about that. As to the metrics reports, one of the things we're looking at is a lot has happened since we last changed what we're talking about with the board, right? So if you think about Volkswagen and Wells Fargo and other things that have happened where the board is squarely in the spotlight in a not so good way. In our view, we think societal expectations around what boards should know, what boards should be receiving, has changed potentially, and so we're doing a little bit of work to put together a redo, if you will, of what our board is actually seeing. We're benchmarking and doing some other things. Summaries of every single investigation was an interesting thing I heard. We made eye contact. My team is sitting over here. I'm like, interesting. Should allegations go? There's all kinds of allegations versus confirmed results, right? So like what actually goes, what doesn't. And so I think it's timely that we talk about that, because what we don't want to happen is for those to become rote and not engaging, right? We want to engage our board. We want to get them what they need, and frankly, we want to make sure we are giving them what society and regulators expect that they are receiving. So we're in the midst of doing that. We're going to present it, in fact, the next board meeting in June, and we'll get their feedback on it as well. But it's a timely question, and that's kind of how we balance the mundane with the issues du jour.
Overshare.
Yeah.
If you think that a board absolutely doesn't need it, maybe then not. But anything that a board could glean insight from, you should share it. I will tell you from both sides, from my day job as well as sitting on a board myself. Having sat on a board and been in the situation where something really bad happened and I didn't find out about it as a board member until it was in the news several months later, I left that board. And it was with in the university setting, but nonetheless, that level of transparency. So we also do summaries of all matters, allegations, and so substantiated and unsubstantiated matters, and then at each meeting, in the context of my discussion, I provide insights into that. So it's not just raw. Here's what we received as far as allegations. It's, over the last year, we've actually seen a lot more allegations coming up in India, and here's what we're going to do about it. Or we've seen allegations of this type, and frankly, there have been a couple of times where the board has said, last year you had this kind of allegation in there, and can you tell me about it? And that's great. That's exactly, frankly, the kind of discussion, the meaty discussion you want your board to be having with you. So I think that metrics and data is absolutely great, but raw data and information, when you can just hand it to your board so that they're seeing sort of the rubber meet the road on a daily basis, gives your board a great deal of confidence over what's happening well and what's not, frankly, within your organization.
So I would say the same. What I tell my various teams whose program information rolls up into my audit committee reports, I'm representing you in front of the board. This is the only opportunity they have to understand what you do, that you do it, that it's done well. It's a first step. What do you want me to tell the board about what you do? Keeping in mind that they're not experts in privacy or Medicare compliance or risk or whatever. So we go through this refining process, and a lot of times they ask, is this something the board will understand without me being there? I mean, they're going to be reading this somewhere, before the meeting. Is this issue, term, whatever, going to raise more questions than it answers? So let's address that. But we do put in metrics, and my audit committee has said, we're really interested in the outlier stuff. So, they want to see, and I usually submit, like 4 quarters of information on, trends or whatever, in a graph form, because unlike unlike the lawyers in the room, like myself and my GC and a whole bunch of other people who were very prose focused, like, let me read about it. You know, most of these people are, you know, have some kind of financial background and they want to flip through them and see the charts and be like, oh, there's a giant spike, and then, you know, have you focus on that. So we definitely try to combine that graphic types of information, pie charts and things like that, and then provide the context as well and put it into the context of, you know, is this a big deal? Before my tenure as Chief Risk and Compliance Officer, I heard of situations where board members were like, why wasn't this brought to my attention before? Nothing catastrophic, but you never want to get to a situation where a board member is like, this is really interesting. How come nobody told me about it before? So you want to continue to kind of feed them information throughout the year. Rolling it up at the quarterly or, you know, however frequently you meet meetings is really good, but it should be validating their confidence that everything's fine or somebody would tell me different. You don't want to end on a note of, oh, and by the way, there's a giant, you know, debacle coming. And you mentioned, you know, Wells Fargo. My board was very concerned about that. They were like, are we doing things to incentivize bad behavior? And, you know, I was able to say, like, well, we've jumped into places where people are compensated based on, you know, sales or growth or membership numbers. And, you know, we've worked with the compensation teams to understand how they are being compensated so that there isn't an incentive for them to be like, I don't know, churning members or whatever the marketing people in healthcare do. So, yeah, the numbers really mean a lot, and you can have them go back and flip back and say, oh yeah, a year ago, you know, when we do the annual sum up, it's like year over year.
Right. One of the
Go ahead.
One of the things we also do that I think gives our board comfort is we provide this quarterly report I mentioned is actually an integrated report. It's organized by enterprise risk management risk, right? So, and inputting into that report is, of course, ethics, compliance, audit, quality, and health, safety, and environmental. So all of those go together. And I think it's one way to demonstrate to the board that what I call our sister control functions, right, are cooperating. We're working together. There's not, you know, turf wars and you're stepping on my toes. Rather, it's a collaborative effort where we're all, you know, driving toward the same end. And sort of, it's as simple as making sure that all of our information is reported in a way and it's organized in a way to sort of demonstrate that. It also helps us, right? So when you're working collaboratively with your sister control functions that way, things don't fall between the cracks and you don't have an inconsistent statement in the audit section that looks strange when you compare it to quality or E&C. And so it's, I think that's one of the things, and we've heard good feedback on that piece of the report. I'm assuming it will stay that way. And again, organized by risk, so that it keeps at the top of their mind always enterprise risk management and what we're doing to mitigate risk, sort of across functions.
So we're talking about reporting, and I just want to sort of flip on its head that word a little bit, because when we think about reporting to the audit committee, we're thinking about our quarterly reports and what those look like. But reporting to an audit committee does not necessarily have to happen in the context of your quarterly meetings.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
the fact of the matter is, throughout the year, I will have specific opportunities to be speaking to the chair of the audit committee about issues that arise, because frankly they are big enough and important enough that they should know about them now, not in a month and a half when I have the next meeting
Absolutely
with them.
right.
So we have a pretty clearly delineated system that says any matter that sort of looks like this, and you can imagine them, but they're big, hairy, ugly matters that involve senior people or involve significant brand risk or financial risk, they should know about it now. And I think that kind of reporting outside of the committee meeting again, it gives them an opportunity to feel, one, engaged, make sure that they are confident and comfortable about how those matters are being handled. And also, it then never comes as a surprise, saying, didn't know that was happening.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Louis. We'll pause here for questions from the audience if there are any.
Yeah,
Alan?
Doug, I'd be interested in knowing if any of you have ever brought in an outside speaker or an outside resource to do training or whatever you might want to call it, or whether or not you've done it. Have you ever heard of anybody else doing it, and how's it gone, and what was the reaction to it?
Yeah, we do. I every year bring in an outside speaker for the board to do our board training. This past year we switched it up. Usually it's been some boring dude from a law firm. This time I asked my GC, does it have to be this boring dude from a law firm? And he was like, no. So we got an ethics, specialist, a compliance specialist who, is now a consultant she's, I think she's one of the founders of this Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and she was fantastic. I mean, they are still talking about this, hour or so. The session ran over. They were so engaged with, the conversation that she brought to them. And what I do is, we talk about what the board is like, who's on the board. I usually give them the person the bios so that they know who they're talking to and what the background looks like. And then my GC and I will sit down with the presenter and talk about our company because, as I said, we're not a publicly traded company, so it's going to be kind of silly if they come in and talk about, impact to stock and, stocks and whatever. So we talk about, how bizarrely we are regulated in California and how we have, multiple regulators for various lines of business. So they're really prepped and ready to come in, and we throw out some ideas for what topics they might want to cover, and they bring us ideas and we kind of let them go. But the board really, really enjoys that outside perspective. Like these guys, sometimes people are on multiple boards, and so they've heard, okay, be good, behave, federal sentencing guidelines, blah, 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 fiduciary duty. Like they don't need to hear that from every board. So we try to make it relevant to them, timely, and also relevant to what's going on in our space. So again, that will provoke some conversation with the board and me after they've had their training.
I would say, Alan, we do it in a couple of contexts. One, we use an external board advisor, and so we've contracted for an advice where one of the big four to go and look at certain parts of our program and then come in and present to the board on their findings and what they find. And that gives us an opportunity to get an external perspective, and it by definition is relative to their other clients, right? So it's an opportunity for them to educate the board, not just about our program, but kind of what is best practice across the board. So that's one context. And then we also do external speakers. So for instance, I mentioned one of those deep dives, right? Two of the 4 meetings are deep dives into topics du jour. One of those, for instance, upcoming for us is just sort of current happenings in the anti-corruption, anti-kickback space, to make sure that they're up to speed on the latest enforcement, the latest trends, the latest thinking of the regulators. Often it's boring lawyers. I, being a lawyer, I can say that, I guess, with reckless abandon. But it has gone very well. I think it's good. It's just healthy to have an external eye come in and they can ask all kinds of questions, right, about how we compare to others, et cetera. And I think it's just healthy hygiene. It's kind of a bit of taking our own medicine in having someone come and look at our program independently and then and present that.
So we certainly do, and we've had lawyers, we've had accountants and others. Nothing significantly different than what Hope and Melissa have said, but also we bring in internal people. So
absolutely.
I will use the expertise on my team
Yeah.
to help present stuff because of lots of reasons. Who wants to listen to me all the time? I barely want to listen to me most of the time. So, but the fact of the matter is, I have an amazing team, and I want the board to have an opportunity to know the quality of talent that we have, and the fact that that luckily someday Lewis won't be here, and we'll have plenty of good people to take his place, and that frankly is just as important in helping the board and training the board on the key issues, because those are really the experts who know what's happening in your business.
I completely agree, and we do the same. And I think it accomplishes two things. One, when you're part of the board, if management won't let you see sort of what's below them, I mean, I think that's a big red flag, right? So as a board member, you want to have access and the ability to ask questions and probe a little bit to those levels below senior most management. So I think that's one thing that it just increases the trust and credibility in your program and in your team. Likewise, it's a wonderful development opportunity, right? So if you want to get the best talent in your organization and really develop them and give them opportunities, it's a great way to do that.
So to the point about the transparency in the organization, I actually will use my audit committee members in my own trainings. So we've got lots of programs across the company, one of which is similar to a compliance liaison type program, and we do week-long trainings on a biannual basis. And when we do those trainings, we actually have sessions where we bring the audit committee in to talk to our team members. And so there'll be 20 to 50 people in a room, and the audit committee actually, they get to know, they get questions from, and they also get to give the board's view of the importance of compliance and ethics to the people within the organization, which the benefits are almost uncountable.
Yeah, that's great.
In that
Yeah,
respect.
great question, Al. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience at this point in time?
And I might have missed this, I came in a little late, I apologize, but you were talking about how you give all reports to the board, I mean, of any investigations, is that? So I'm assuming that because a lot of your job is gatekeeper, right? That you guys are saying, make sure the board sees it, but if you inundate them with everything that's going on. So do you basically have, here are a summary of all the reports, here are the three we really think you need to focus on, but if you want to look, here it is that?
For me, it's an appendix to the rest of the compliance materials that I'm submitting, and it's it's an Excel spreadsheet format, but it has columns that they can look at it. So there'll be a column that has the senior most officer responsible for whatever that was. So if they're like, I want to see, how many times Joe's name appears on here, regardless of what the issues are, they can look at it that way. But there's also columns on, we say what sort of the violation or the alleged violation was, and who was it reported by, an employee, a vendor, that kind of thing. So there's enough information for them to, at a glance, get a sense of it. And then we have a very brief summary of what the allegation was. I mean, they're tiny. They're like, boxes this big. And we don't have a ton every quarter. It's pretty bad. The first and second quarter get mushed together, so that's a lot. But, they're seeing it in small pieces. And not everything gets wrapped up within, speaking of which, my director of compliance and ethics just came in. She has to do the summaries with me. But if we really, I had actually spoken to my predecessor about this. I was like, why don't we just tell them the substantiated ones? Some of these are Tommy ate my lunch, and then it's like, nah, that didn't happen, right? And he was like, well, and I thought he had a good point. He's like, well, where do you cut off the filter?
Right.
Like, we don't have so many that it's unwieldy. So they're able to see that we're reporting everything, all of the nonsense and the real stuff. And then they get to see the outcome of what it was. And sometimes it's, the person was counseled and the matter is closed. Sometimes it's like the person was, let go. Other times they can see how we work together with other, our sister resources, right? So we referred the employee relations issues over, the Tommy ate my lunch stuff, we referred over to employee relations, but we looked at, the compliance issue. And they like it. you know, I think it's the one thing that's really tangible to them, and it gives them like a little insight into really what's going on among the employee population. What kinds of things are people reporting? And they can, you know, again, at a quick glance, see, oh, it seems like most of the stuff is getting reported by employees, or a lot of this stuff is coming in anonymously. There seems to be a lot of finance-related issues. So they like it.
So I'd say the board knows very clearly what issues I think are important through my reporting, both my written report as well as my verbal report to the board. What I don't know is what is important to them.
Yeah.
And that actually is what I've gotten most out of giving them lots of information. Because there will be times where a very small issue, and it was a very small, almost meaningless issue, but it triggered something that they experienced in another company. And so it gets them to ask a question and start a discussion. And those kinds of discussions, no, nothing bad happened at Dun & Bradstreet here, but wow, this is a great idea for how we can do things even better as a company that we weren't thinking of. And so that's where that sharing more than you theoretically need to has really come into play for me, and why it's been a value.
So we're, again, looking at this right now, and I do think there is, the key here is effective communication, right? And you can inundate to the point that it's meaningless,
Absolutely.
you know, phone books. And, you know, when you compile kind of everything, and I'm talking well beyond just investigations, of course, or allegations, but and it's not effective or meaningful communication. So I think the key is finding the balance between, and it requires judgment. And look, that's why we're paid. Okay, in some respects, you're absolutely right. The board knows certainly what I believe is important. What I think are the key matters that are coming out, and key trends, et cetera. All of that is brought out, not just in written form, but in orally as well. But I don't think data dump is the right approach. And in fact, it feels in some respects like a data dump is a bit of CYA, as opposed to a meaningful communication and discussion platform with your board. And so there's a little art and a little science, a lot of judgment that I think has to come into play, and finding that right balance requires asking so we're doing interviews, right? We're asking for feedback, we're presenting drafts and saying, is this helpful? Is this what is most important to you? Is this how that you want to see this arranged graphically in an engaging way? That prompts a discussion, because ultimately that's what you want. And if you're never talking about the reports that go in quarterly, in my mind, that's a big red flag that it's not meaningful communication, and it's time to change it up and really get to the point where you're having real discussions about what you're giving to the board.
One thing I will say, you know, to Lewis's point, I had submitted my investigation summaries, and I didn't think there was anything important in there. And then this was the prior audit committee chair, like, zoned in on this tiny immaterial amount of money, because I always try to put in, if there is a financial impact, what it could be, just to give them context. You know, is it $1 zillion or is it, you know, $10,000 or something? And it was not a full investigation. It was, you know, we are still investigating this, but whatever it was just a small amount of money. I didn't really think there was anything important about it. And it triggered this whole conversation with the audit committee around, we want to know about anything that has any potential financial impact. Like, as the audit committee chair, I want you to call me about that. This isn't anything I would have ever applied. It turned out to be like not a thing. But I wouldn't have gotten that piece of information without them, like, just happening to zone in on that. And then we had the conversation about, I was like, oh, okay, if this type of thing ever happens again, I will let you know, regardless of, you know, materiality or whether I think it's going to be substantiated. So you do have to kind of talk to your committee members. You know, what do you want to hear? What's gonna bring meaning to you about what we're trying to have a conversation around?
Yeah, and I think Melissa's point about data dump is really fair. If you're just sending out information because you have information, then that's actually never a reason to send it. you are only sending information to your board that will help them understand the context and quality of your programs, and providing them with whatever insights you can into that. But just sending out information to send out information doesn't help them. I think it goes to one of the points we haven't really touched on, and sort of how do you talk to your board within the context of those reports. And I think that there's a bit of a, excuse me for the way I'll say it, but a C-spot run way of doing reporting to the board, because although board members are amongst the most intelligent people you'll ever meet, they are also amongst the busiest people, and so you have to give them information in very consumable bites.
Exactly.
And so making sure that the information you are providing is done in such a way that they can consume it quickly, easily, and understand the issues effectively is it's an art. But that is frankly, I think, what really we are called to do if you want your board to be able to be effective.
Yeah, completely agree. And the only thing I would add is I aspire, I would say, to communicate with the board in a way that I get the benefit of their brains. Because these are among the most impressive, intelligent, experienced people that you would ever want to meet. And what a shame not to communicate with them in a way where you're getting the benefit of that experience and those brains. So in my mind, that's, communication goes both ways. And I want to hear from them what I can glean to make myself and the company better.
Yeah, great point. So I know we have just about a minute and a half left. So we had talked primarily about substance and sort of cadence with board communications. And I think, Melissa, you just touched on this topic earlier, but to what extent do you all dedicate time or a process to a feedback loop for the board and ensuring that what you're doing is effective? So a report on the report, if you will, or how do you structure or formalize that sort of feedback loop and ensuring that what you're doing is effective with respect to communication?
Well, I'll start. For us, it's a formal assessment process. Our board goes through regularly. Our portion is included within that assessment, and we have certain questions we ask around the information that we're providing, how it's provided, the relationship with the people, sort of just how the committee runs, frankly. And so it's just part of the formal board assessment process.
Yeah, for us, we have a formal board assessment, and then each committee has a formal assessment of how effective they are operating in pursuant to their charter. And as part of that, the key business leaders who are part of assisting the board help with that assessment as well. So it is very much a two-way communication with the board in that assessment process of what they see as working really well, and as openly and honestly as possible, identifying the things that could be working better. And I think that actually our last meeting is when we had it at the audit committee, and it was a great discussion. People were really comfortable with the fact that, things are really great in certain ways, but there's some things that we could be doing better. And if you're not willing to find the things that you can do better, then even though it might be working well today, I guarantee you next year at this time it won't be. You always have to be looking out for things that you can be doing better.
Yeah, and similarly, we do that on an annual basis as well to kind of take the temperature and is this the right format? And I will just say really quickly, when I took over the role, we had a very, very different format of board materials that I supported my boss in building. It was very heavy on, paragraphs and written content and all that. And because of the timing of his departure and my takeover, I just plugged all of the new information into it for the next upcoming board meeting. And I was super happy because it's very hard to proofread, all of those, details and make sure everything's right and ticked and tied. And I handed it to my GC for review, and I said, I have a meeting with I hadn't spoken to her ever before. I have a meeting with the audit committee chair, and I'm going to talk to her about this report. And he says, okay, I'll review it in the meantime. So I get on the phone and I'm like, hey, Evelyn, is the format of this report okay? Because I just finished it. And she goes, "We hate that report. I have been telling your predecessor for years that we hate it. We want more charts and graphs and pictures." And I was like, oh my God, I have to like completely redo it. Now I have like, a week and a half to get it all converted into some new format they've never seen. But it's really important to listen to the board members, what do you want to see and how do you want to see it? I'm trying to make it easy for them so that there's not a barrier between me and them, and they can just get right into the conversation.
Yeah, excellent point. Well, by the applause next door, I think we're out of time.
I thought they liked your point
They
a
like
lot.
my point. It's perfect.
So Melissa, Lewis, and Hope, thank you very much for your time. Great
pleasure.
discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.